She's bringing her panel members with her, and she will introduce them. But I just have to say a few words about Liz. I view Liz as the single most impactful person I have ever interacted with in terms of influencing events in Washington from outside the government. She is a force, and she has assembled at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition this amazing group of several hundred generals and admirals, former ambassadors. She's got an organization in every state. She's got the most prominent people working with her, and no one can say no to her, and she has the issue of U.S., American, international engagement, including on all the issues we are going to address. And most significantly to me, it's at the intersection of conflict and peace and food security and national security. Liz, thank you for doing this. Thank you for putting this wonderful panel together. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Quinn. I can't say no to you, and I should have come the last 17 years after that introduction. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. This is an extraordinary event to bring this crowd of thought leaders, practitioners together to rise to the challenge. And how extraordinary to take a look at the question of how do we feed the world 9 billion people by 2050, and are we ready to rise to the challenge? And our topic is not an easy topic. Ken gave us the topic of hunger, conflict, and peace. And thank goodness I have the three people to my left to help figure out this question. Now we're going to get to peace, but I want to just throw out a couple facts for everybody to get around their head about the nexus of hunger and conflict, hunger, conflict, and peace, so we can really dig into this conversation. You know, if we had been sitting here 10 years ago, the global food prices spiked, and it created riots in nearly 40 countries. Sitting here today, we have this alarming rise in global hunger for the first time in years, after we had seen global hunger go down after dating back to the Green Revolution. Today, we're sitting at a moment where we know the facts, all of you in this room. 120 million people go to bed hungry every day, and within that number, 30 million people, 30 million are at risk of famine. Where are those people living? They're largely in 4 countries. All 4 countries are sadly living in countries that are largely because of man-made conflict. So no wonder we're looking at the question of hunger and conflict. And one more stat to leave in your mind. It's a statistic that my friend Nancy Lindborg always reminds me. If we were again sitting here 10 years ago, if we were looking at U.S. assistance, humanitarian assistance, 80% of our humanitarian assistance would have been going to natural disasters, responding to natural disasters, 20% to conflict areas. But today, our U.S. humanitarian assistance, 80% is going to relieve conflict areas. So this issue of the nexus of conflict and hunger is really right where the world is happening. So let me introduce our panel so you know who's going to help us unravel it. Nancy Lindborg, sitting in the middle, you know which one is Nancy probably, just so you know, what do I have to do this? A general, a diplomat, and a development expert. How smart is this to have these three? So Nancy Lindborg is the development expert. She has had a career in the space of fragility, really one of the world premieres of understanding fragility and conflict. In her government hat, when she was in government, I'm not going to go through her whole bio, but 2 points to know about. She was the top player at USAID dealing at the Dacha Bureau, Democracy, I'm going to get this right, Conflict and Humanitarian Assistance, and today is the president of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Our diplomat today is Ambassador Michael Klosson. He served most of his career as a foreign service officer, too many places in the world to tell you about, but ended as ambassador to Cyprus, and today is here as the vice president in policy and humanitarian response at Save the Children. And our general, 40 years in the military, again, too many places to tell you about, but his last post was as the first combatant commander setting up AFRICOM, U.S. AFRICOM. So welcome, General Kip Ward. So with that, I'm going to start with, of the 3 words we have, conflict. And of course, General Ward, the first question is going to go to you. I work with you at USGLC with over 200 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals. You are among them. And one of the things you have taught me is that generals and admirals are the most voiceful players on the world stage who say the threats in the world today are not military solutions alone. And you have gone with me to Capitol Hill to say that we have to respond investing in development and diplomacy. So one of the things I want to understand is when you were setting up AFRICOM, when you were there, how did you see the conflict and the threats of hunger in your strategy at AFRICOM? Welcome.
Well, thank you, and I add my thanks to the organizers, Ambassador Quinn, for including me in this program, which has such relevance in today's environment, given where we are as a global community. The task at hand when we established U.S. Africa Command was to do what we could to help our friends on the continent of Africa create for themselves and for the global community a more stable environment. And one of the major drivers of instability on the continent, and in other places as well, is the issue of food insecurity and what could be done to increase food security, because those conditions, left to go unchecked, created conflict among neighbors, among nations, among tribes, and what seemingly could have been something resolved at a very early stage turned into something that was immensely difficult to solve because it had grown so complex as it could have been stopped early on in its condition set. Food, agriculture, tied with water, those sorts of things cause human beings globally. We talked about Africa, but I've served around the world, Europe, Asia, South America, and that requirement to be able to feed your children, to feed your aging parents in a nutritional way is a driver that motivates women and men globally. It's better if it can be done in a positive way. If not, then it will result in things that are dissatisfying to our national security structures, that are destabilizing to our national security interests, and impact the ability of nations globally to work in a way that causes us to share the precious resources of our world. As a soldier for over 40 years, I was typically called to go to a place when it had gone south, so to speak, when conditions had deteriorated such that we were in a conflict scenario where no one was winning. My soldiers who were in those, and sailors, airmen and Marines who were there, ran the risk of losing their life. It came at a huge cost to our national treasures because of how much we had to spend to deploy, to train. But importantly, it came at a huge cost to the impacted peoples, and as such, led to their further instability that led to conditions that we see today. And so as we built U.S. Africa Command, one of our central tenets was to how do we help create conditions, not to do the work for our friends, but to cause what we do to support their efforts to be able to be more food stable, to be more food independent so they could feed their people and take away that potential such that it would then lead to other destabilizing impacts along the global commons, which had an impact on our national security.
That is a perfect jumping off point to get to Nancy. Nancy, you are one of the premier voices in Understand Fragility. USIP just did a bipartisan, really powerful bipartisan report looking at what the underlying causes are of conflict, of fragility. And one of the stats we've been talking, the whole theme of the conference is looking at what happens in 2050 when 9 billion, 10 billion people live on this planet. But one of the other things that's going to happen in 2050 is something that was in the report, which is half the world's poor are going to be living in conflict areas of states. So talk about, if we're going to try to solve world poverty, if we're going to solve hunger, we have to deal with fragility. So where does fragility and hunger intersect? How do you see that?
Great. Thank you, Liz. And again, let me add my congratulations to Ambassador Quinn, and thank you for sharing the stories of Governor Ray. I think we all need that kind of inspiration in our lives right now. On this issue of fragility, first of all, fragility, let's remember what it is. It is fundamentally when a government is not responsive to the needs of its people. That social compact is frayed or broken down, and it can be lack of capacity or outright repression. And when Liz talked about those 4 countries that have been teetering in and out of famine for the last 5 years, all 4 of those countries, Somalia, Yemen, Northeast Nigeria, and South Sudan, are deeply characterized by fragmented societies and by governments that do not prioritize the needs of their citizens. They are not delivering, and people don't feel like they have a voice and a choice. And so when you think about hunger and conflict, we have to be thinking about what are the government structures. And having spent 25 years on the front lines of a lot of these different conflict areas, what we see is that years of investment in health, education, agriculture is overturned during a conflict. So to have that kind of development progress sustained, it's essential that we think about how to build peace. And to build peace, you need to engage the kind of structures that enable a more successful agreement between citizenry and their governments. And we see every day the terrible situation in Syria. And I would remind you that for the 5 years before the Arab Spring, Syria experienced a terrible drought. 75% of the farms failed, livestock was wiped out, and then in the riots that Liz referred to in 2008, prices were spiking on essential food items and on livestock feed. And at that point in Syria's history, 1.5 million people left the rural areas and moved to the farms. And that set the stage for the left the farms and moved to the urban areas. And that set the stage for the kind of unrest that led to the riots that were quickly overtaken by armed actors, and we've seen what has happened since then. So as we think about getting to the roots of this, it has moved 80% to conflict-affected victims, but it's deeply intertwined with the increasing tempo of droughts, of natural disasters, the lack of governments and countries and communities' ability to respond to disagreements, to shocks of climate impacts, and the inability to manage those shocks without dissolving into conflict. And so this is the critical challenge that we need to address, especially as we look at the demographic pressures and what we're looking ahead as there will be more and more people, greater impact on our food systems. This is what we need to embrace with vigor if we want to rise to the challenge.
So I'm going to come back to you on what we can do about it, but let me get Michael into the conversation. Save the Children is literally on the front line of the conflict of hunger and in a lot of the places that Nancy and General Ward are already talking about. 30 million people that are at risk of famine, You're dealing with a lot of the most vulnerable, the children. You were just in, I believe, South Sudan, where 2/3 of the population are at risk of starvation. So give us, as sad and as frightening as this is, a bird's eye look. What is happening on the ground when you went into South Sudan and saw when conflict and hunger meet up?
Okay, thanks. And it's great to be here with my Foreign Service colleague, Ken Quinn. And I was also struck by the variety of perspectives that are represented in this room, because I think the issues we're talking about really require all these different viewpoints to be brought to bear, and out of that, I think perhaps some new thinking can come about. So as Liz was saying, I mean, Save the Children is on the front lines of many of the toughest places in the world to be a child, and this sort of toxic combination of hunger and conflict are really robbing a lot of children of their childhoods, if not their lives. And we actually did a calculation looking out at the 10 worst conflicts in the world, including South Sudan, and we're projecting that if nothing changes, that by the end of the year, it's very likely that roughly 600,000 kids will die because they'll miss treatment and as a result of hunger. So it's really graphic. I've visited. I mean, South Sudan was one of the places that I've been to, and on the one hand, it's gut-wrenching when you're seeing these families in such distress. It's really tough. It's life-changing. But at the same time, it's how you see people dealing with this is really quite inspiring. And the topic or the theme for this conference is Rise to the Challenge. I mean, when I'm in South Sudan and in Eastern Equatoria, or if I'm at Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, I'm seeing people rise to the challenge, and you come away with a real sense of inspiration. These are folks that are in this kind of situation, are not throwing in the towel and giving up. So it's really the support that the U.S. government provides in terms of assistance, the work that a lot of nonprofits like Save the Children are able to do. It's really providing practical assistance to people, and it really makes a difference, and it's appreciated. So it's hugely important. What I saw was, kids in a lot of distress. They're out of school. Their bodies are showing the signs of malnutrition, stunting, or some cases wasting. And what we're able to do is, but the good news is that we were seeing at the local level, particularly in Eastern Equatoria, the county level governments, many of the staff haven't been paid for 6 months, a year, when I was there earlier this year. But nevertheless, they're on the job, and they're really trying to help out their kids. And so you really get a sense of we're investing. We're not coming in to sort of save somebody else. We're in there as a partnership to work with folks at the ground level, and it's a partnership where we can bring expertise, and you have the political will on the part of certainly the local government folks. So I think there's a lot more to do. I have some thoughts on what needs to happen, but I guess we'll come into that in a little bit.
Let's shift to a little bit. So hunger, conflict, peace. So let's try to bring in the peace part. Nancy, your title of your organization is U.S. Institute of Peace. So let's talk about what we can do. And I want to pick up on another conflict region we haven't hit on yet. And Madam Vice President, I'm going to turn to your region. We were talking about it at lunch today, and talk about the conflict in Venezuela. And I saw some stats that were stunning to me, that the average Venezuelan, according to statistics, has lost 24 pounds because of the lack of food or lack of, the crisis going on. That there was a poll that said 60% have said that they have not had money to buy food. But the challenge is that it is affecting the whole region, and it's affecting peace challenges in neighboring regions. So talk about how you just using that as a window, what is happening in the region in Latin America? How do we get to peace? Just looking at that as an example.
Well,
and that's a hard one.
All of these are
I picked them all hard.
Yeah.
I didn't pick easy ones for you.
The challenge, obviously, is that we're seeing this increase of these kinds of conflicts that are the result of fragile states that are often exacerbated by regional and international interference. But in Venezuela, I think all of us have seen the news. You have a middle-income country that has been driven to the brink of ruin, with enormous numbers of people who are pushed to the brink of starvation. Many of them are leaving the country, putting great pressures on the neighboring countries. And U.S. Institute of Peace has spent a decade supporting a peace process that is still in a very delicate stage as that country climbs out of 50 years of conflict, teetering on the brink of peace. It is now threatened by the Venezuela conflict, both because of the flood of refugees across the border, but also because of Venezuela's support for the remnants of the militias inside Colombia. So what you see are how all of these issues intertwine, and they have impact on the citizens of the country in conflict, of the country, of the region, and ultimately, if you look at some of the migration and the fleeing of people across the border into our country, it becomes a much broader set of difficult issues.
So on the peace question, I'm going to ask a tough question to you, General Ward. The head of the World Food Program is former Governor David Beasley. He's wonderful. I think you've hosted him here before. And he talked about how food is a weapon being used by recruitment of terrorists. And I'm going to read you a quote from him. And I want you to answer, how do we get to peace given this? And this is what he said. He said, what ISIS is now doing is coming into an already fragile area, a very destabilizing area because of climate impact and governance, and they're infiltrating, recruiting, using food as a weapon of recruitment to destabilize so they can have mass migration into Europe. So, this is his view. He's running the World Food Program, and this is his view of how he's seeing a terrorist organization using food as a weapon. And so what's the answer? How do we combat that? How do we combat it and really get to that goal, which is peace?
That is a great question to ask, and we could write a book about how to combat it. So I'll do my best because Liz will...
You don't have a book. You only have a couple minutes because I want to get to group questions.
Two things let me say. Firstly, when food is provided in bulk type forms and it's distributed, we know that there are transparency issues, accountability issues, and so therefore it doesn't always get to where it needs to be. And those who have control of that have the ability to dictate where it goes, and as such, it can be used as a weapon that will create other unstable conditions. Quick example, teammates. In 2009, I'm in Ghana, and I'm at a small co-op with a Ghanaian lady and her 5 children who needed to increase the yield from their little plot of ground so that she could raise enough food to feed her children. I had a young sergeant who was an engineer that knew a little about irrigation, helped her create an irrigation system so that she could raise enough food to feed her children without the threat of some rogue actor coming in and influencing not just her, but her young sons who are most susceptible to being taken in, recruited by these organizations or groups that would then do nefarious things. Because of those actions, not only could she feed her children and keep them healthy, she could raise enough product to sell so that she could then buy clothes to send her children to school for an education. And as opposed to she and her family being refugees, they were stabilized right there where they are. And as a part of that, she was able to bring into her little co-op 3 other families to do the same thing. That helped to create stability that is sustainable and not being controlled by others, such that she was not contributing, nor were her sons, and in some cases daughters, contributing to those things that would then have impact on us here at home in the United States of America, in Europe, or wherever. And so when we pay attention to those sorts of things, we reduce the impact of those destabilizing factors that they would have on those who would use food as a weapon for purposes not supportive of anyone's interests, let alone our national interests.
That's great. Question for Michael. Nancy, you might have a thought about this too. I am going to open up to questions in just a moment, but one of the real challenges that we've seen in some of these conflict areas is access, is that we have a will, But the warring parties in places like Yemen, Syria, you mentioned as well, actively prevent assistance from even getting into the country. So here we have a country like Yemen. They're on the brink of the worst famine in 100 years. I had read yesterday the number actually went up to now 14 million people at the risk of starvation, which includes 5 million children. So you have been a diplomat most of your life. You worked in government as well. How do we take the diplomatic community, the military community, and bear pressure to get our humanitarian assistance in? So, Michael, if you can kick it off, and again, Nancy, you might have some comments as well.
Sure. So, I mean, Yemen really is a poster child for this toxic combination of hunger and conflict. And as Liz was saying, it's on the brink of maybe the worst famine in a century. So it's really dire. And there's a couple of components to that. Part of it is that the warring parties have been attacking some of the infrastructure, so the food-producing infrastructure, the water, so that puts people at risk. Part of it is this issue of access, whether it's through the main port in Hodeidah or getting the assistance out to where it needs to go. But there's also another part, which is in the currency has collapsed in Yemen. So you've had a real devaluation of rial. So even if there's, in some places there is food, but people can't afford it. So there's sort of a mixture of things. I think on the access point, it's very much, hunger is not an issue only for humanitarians. Hunger is a whole of government issue, and what needs to happen is the whole of government needs to swing in. And frankly, if some of the executive branch is not swinging in hard enough, then there's other parts of the government that ought to use its voice to say that this is important. So from our perspective, sort of drawing attention to the fact that we could face a 100-year famine in Yemen is to try to galvanize both American public opinion but also congressional opinion to further energize an executive branch action. So I mean it's very much solving this hunger conflict crisis is very much up to our humanitarians. It's very much up to our diplomats, and they have to be on the front line of that. And when I was in South Sudan, as you mentioned, I spent a fair amount of time at the embassy because the same problems. Access to parts of Sudan, we couldn't get access. That's not something that humanitarians in and of themselves can always solve. So you need a whole of government response, and we need to understand that the stakes that are involved, as General Ward was talking about, these are huge stakes for America and ought to motivate and put these issues very high up our diplomatic agenda.
And Nancy, you might have some thoughts, and as you're addressing this, you also dealt with some times where government did work. So lessons learned from when you were in charge, when we were dealing with the Ebola crisis, when we were dealing with responses to tsunamis, when we were dealing with responses to earthquakes. And are there any lessons learned when government does work right?
Well, I think, the U.S. government has extraordinary capabilities with the ability to make a very important difference in the lives of people and countries. And I want to give a shout out because the head of Food for Peace at USAID is sitting right in the front row, Matt Nims. And somewhere in the audience is Dina Esposito, who previously was the head of Food for Peace. And I had the opportunity to work with both of them during two examples of where access was really a problem. One in Somalia, where Al-Shabaab was blocking access, and one in Syria where terrorists were making it very dangerous. And in both instances, the extraordinary creativity of Food for Peace colleagues with other parts of the humanitarian community, international and local actors, came up with ways to get food in. In Somalia, it was working with the market system, with traders to get the food in, who could go in the ways that humanitarian actors couldn't. And in Syria, it was working with the bakeries and using local partners. I mean, so the point I want to make, first and foremost, is that there is unbelievable creativity and courage that addresses these issues with partners like Save the Children. And the second point is local organizations, businesses, and NGOs are essential, that working with them, through them, in partnership with them, enables important things to happen, and more importantly, begin even through the response to build capacity that will sustain you into a more peaceful future. And third, to get to your point and build on Michael's point, when we are able to work across diplomatic, development, humanitarian, and military capabilities together, we are much better equipped to have impact. And I can tell you, having worked in the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2005, which was a chaotic mess. There was no coordination, and there were 17 militaries, and the military and the NGOs and the AID wasn't very coordinated. There has been unbelievable progress. If you fast forward to the Philippines typhoon or the Ebola crisis, where there are agreements, there's understandings of how to work together, and there's training that people train together. So we should be very pleased about how we respond as a US government in coordinated action. Where we haven't gotten good yet is working on the prevention of these crises, of getting upstream with coordinated efforts between our diplomatic, military, and development communities. We are still working on different timelines and different problem sets. We're good on the response. We've gotten much better
On the emergencies.
on the response to crisis. That's where a lot of the funding goes and a lot of the capability, but we really need to focus, if we're going to rise to the challenge, on how do you prevent it.
There are microphones right over here and right over there. Welcome to go ahead and line up. And if I could ask you, no speeches so we can get as many in as possible, but please join us and don't be shy. Please.
Hi. Hi, my name's Ellen Levinson. Hi. This issue of prevention, we talk about it and there's a lot that can be done, we know, on climate and monitoring markets and all that, but when it comes to conflict, we actually do see things building. I mean, what we saw in Yemen, and when we knew that the Saudis were so disruptive, they were angry about the Iranian potential presence, so we actually saw that coming and then said, okay to the bombing. So I just wondered, all of the people of goodwill sitting up there, how do we prevent that? How do we influence so that can be, stemmed early on? That was a big mistake, and it's continuing. So just love to hear how you think about that. Thanks.
So Nancy, you want to start that one off? Or do you want the general to start that one? That gets to your point of we're still not good at this prevention side and working on the three pillars together.
That's right.
And again, we have a general, a diplomat, and development expert, and they all will, I think, probably reinforce they still work in silos.
Yes. And Ellen, I know you have a long engagement with Yemen, and this is heartbreaking, but especially, I'm sure, for you. Before the current crisis, I was in Yemen, where 40% of the population was already food insecure, and the malnutrition was rampant. This was the definition of a fragile country. And what we didn't pay attention to was thinking longer term about the ramifications of entering into the bombing campaign and supporting that. What I think is, we have the challenge of thinking collectively, both short-term and long-term, how to understand our security needs and what might happen from short-term actions for our long-term security. And that requires a different way of organizing the US government to have those conversations, because the development voice that might bring those issues forward is frankly not always present at the table when those decisions are being made. So one of the things that we do at the U.S. Institute of Peace is really focus on how to bring together all of those voices across political parties and across disciplines to think more creatively about how to address some of these critical issues and to push for that.
So let me ask you, one of the things I know, Nancy, you did when you were at USAID is to make sure there was a USAID senior person at each combatant command, which you did when you set up AFRICOM. Your deputy was a foreign service officer. I am told it's better than it was.
Especially at AFRICOM.
Especially at AFRICOM.
Not
but
at all
is
the
it
commands.
good enough? So is civilian military working well enough, particularly in some of these conflict areas?
Better than it was, it's never good enough. Two things I'll say, and I'll be brief. Firstly, when it comes to, and Nancy mentioned, our long-term approach to things. We are a representative democracy, the United States military, as do militaries in legitimate societies, respond to its civilian authority. And so that's you. That's the citizenry of the United States of America. The things that are important to you will then be reflected in our policy structures. And so to the degree that your influence, your voice is being felt with respect to our policy stance, so critically important, so critically important. The constructs that will help that be realized is a construct that we set up in the United States Africa Command, whereby the civilian deputy, as well as a senior developmental advisor, were civilians, so that our military actions were taken in account of what was being done across our developmental sphere as well as our diplomatic sphere, so that our actions complemented what was being done by those two arms of our government as well. Better than it was, not as good as it can be, but we need to continue to work that so that it does get better, so that the things that are important to you as a citizen of the United States of America, or as importantly, a citizen of our global commons, which are things that lead to our stability, our peace, and our prosperity. And those are the things that we continue to have to work on, but your voice and relaying the importance of that, so critically important.
You know, I'll share with all of you one thing. When Ambassador Quinn invited me to put this panel together, I shared with them that every combatant commander comes before the Senate Armed Services Committee every year to testify. You used to do that, comes to the House. And this year they got asked, every single one of them got asked, you know, how important is global development, food security, diplomacy, these programs for you. And every single one of them made kind of like a Jim Mattis, if you remember our Secretary of Defense, who has been a strong supporter, or Secretary Bob Gates used to make these statements. I know he spoke here several years ago. Made these very, very, very strong voice of support for these issues. And I think it's for exactly what General Ward, you're saying. A question on this side.
Yeah, thank you. It's James Smith from the Aegis Trust.
Welcome.
We've spoken how poor we are at early prevention compared to reacting. But are other examples of early prevention that have worked, even if maybe not very well, that we could learn from and apply to other areas? I'm thinking in particular in regard to the Central African Republic. The US government led an early intervention there when there were threats of mass atrocities after the 2012, the 2012 uptick in violence. And Nancy, you were particularly involved in that. Perhaps you'd be able to comment on that.
So the Central African Republic, the other one I would maybe throw in also is Ethiopia, is also an interesting one where great drought. So maybe Nancy and Michael might have a comment on these. So these are places that, you know, could have been much worse. So what did we do right? What are lessons learned of we got these ones right?
Well, you know, let me point to Colombia because there are a couple of critical elements of that lead you back to Central Africa. And very quickly, the U.S. government worked across defense, diplomacy, and development, and over 3 administrations, continuously and in a cooperative way with the Colombians to support that peace process. Still very nascent, but it underscores you need local leadership. It underscores that you need to have that kind of coherent strategy and that it needs to be sustained over time. The Central African Republic example, I would say that it wasn't sustained. I think the U.S. is picking back up now after a bit of a hiatus for several years, trying to support the new peace, the African-led peace and stability initiative. And there is now, I think, leadership with President Touadera that gives us the possibility of helping that country find its way back to peace. But those are some of the critical elements, and that's what we don't always do well. I just would also add that equally critical is that we understand the importance of local voices And you know, as President Reagan famously said, a hungry child knows no politics, and a hungry child can't really do much. And so by enabling populations and communities in need to not be so desperate, they have a greater possibility of adding their voice to their own country's future and making a difference, because that's important for moving a country forward.
Yeah, so maybe a macro point and then a point on Ethiopia. I think the macro point, if you think about it, who in the US government owns peace building? It's clear who owns development. It's pretty clear who owns humanitarian. If you're trying to sort of wind down a conflict, you know, there's diplomacy. But peace building, actually, in the sense we're talking about it, which is sort of a positive stakeholders, you know, stake in their future, where does that sit? And so part of the challenge then is to you have to, as Nancy was saying, you have to put together all these different pieces. It's collectively owned. Not one person is in charge of it. However, the good news, I think, is that at the country, my experience as ambassador, I'm sure Ken's also, is some of the silos that you see in Washington, you don't have them as dramatically sort of siloed at the country team level in country. And if you're the ambassador in that country, you're looking at peace building. And you can have a whole of government within your country team perspective. And then the challenge then is to how do you get the leverage and the clout to bring this to Washington and get it in front of the policymakers that need to get it in front of. That involves a lot of different things. On Ethiopia, I think there's, you know, if you compare 2011, which was a very severe drought and really hit Somalia very hard, but also Ethiopia, to 2017, I actually think the different things changed so that the response in part reflected better preparation and prevention. So in part it was earlier warning, earlier action, but actually the safety nets that were put in place were stronger. The national governments, to your point on local partners, the national governments they rose and got more involved, and local partners. So there are some things that happened that actually in this period from 2011 to 2017 that resulted in less of a problem in 2017 than otherwise would have been the case.
One question on partners. There are a lot of businesses that are here today. And one of the big changes that we have all seen, and thank you to the corporate America who has stepped up to plate, not just the old philanthropic of just giving a check, but really engaged in hunger relief and global development. And I still remember my visits to Africa of seeing, Paul, you're modernizing seed production plants in Ethiopia, and they're extraordinary what they're doing. You're doing a lot of partnerships with them. Is that part of the game changing?
It's absolutely part of the changing landscape, and I think and if you look at the sort of the proportion of American investment that's in the private sector versus official, aid, it's growing very rapidly there. The other interesting thing is that what I find is a lot of our business partners are thinking in terms of sustainable development goals, so they're looking at a lot of challenges like hunger, not only as a development challenge, but as a business challenge and a business opportunity. And so we are partnering.
And you're not going if there's conflict there.
Conflict makes it more complicated, but even there, what we find, there are, for example, with refugee populations that have fled Syria, there are companies, if you're looking at, these refugee situations are protracted, education can't wait. So there are companies that help get involved in distance learning and things like that. There's pathways in. But the broader partners, we're working with Land O'Lakes in Ethiopia, doing a great program on lifting up a lot of different things in the agricultural sector. And women, clearly if you invest in women, the whole family lifts up. And so that's the gender piece is built in there, the youth piece is built in there. It's a great program to reduce malnutrition.
Great. Yes, please.
Zach Nesbitt, Clemson University. Go Tigers. Given that a conflict zone is stabilized, what mechanisms are in place to bring food production back, and do you guys think it's adequate enough?
Can you say it one more time? It was a little hard to hear up here.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Given that a conflict zone is stabilized, what mechanisms are in place to bring food production back to that area, and do you think those mechanisms are adequate?
So what mechanisms are available when there's a conflict zone to bring it back? How do you, there's crisis going on, how do you bring back that food production, that economy? You've all been there.
Yeah,
how do you bring it back?
We got a group of students from Iowa State to go to the country and teach folks how to do things so that they're productive and they make sense and they make money and they feed nutritionally.
There we go. You heard it here.
but truly, and that's why this group is so important. I mean, I think we're preaching to the choir here because you all get the importance of it, but it's how we get involved, how we as a community, a global community, the developmental piece, the governance piece, but importantly, the expertise to cause that, because if you've got a stable environment, in order to keep it stable, then these other things have to flood in like crazy. And our challenge to this point has been that that's been lacking. And so this peace gets created, there's a lack of conflict, but if things aren't there on the heels of that in quick order, it will quickly devolve back to what it was before. So we need all that there quickly to make a difference.
Let's take one last question here, and then I'm going to close up with a final question to the group.
Yeah, Bill Crabtree. I'm an Australian farmer, and I'm privileged to be part of the Global Farmer Network here at this event. And I've been sitting with 5 African wonderful farmers myself, and I grow crops on no rainfall, almost. 12 inches of rain. This year I've had 6, and I think I've got a $3 million crop. And I look at Google Maps and I look at Africa and I think, man, oh man, I could grow a lot of crop there. And what I see is a tree and a washed out gully, and it just doesn't look right. Something's not right. So obviously we don't want the fish story, you give a man a fish or you teach him to fish. How do you think we as a global community could just come up and lift the arms of those wonderful African farmers that I've been sitting with for 2 days and work with them to put structures in place to help their agriculture fly?
All right, one of you gets this, only one. Who wants what is the magic seeds to get Africa going? Who wants that? Nancy, you look like you're ready to go.
I don't have the magic answer, but what I can say is that, one of the big changes that we've seen over the last decade is a shift from a long sustained provision of food aid as quickly as possible to getting people back up on their feet. And in the Sahel, for example, where you're going to see a lot of those arid drylands, I'll just say from my visits, where I've seen extraordinary progress is when you get the women involved, when you've got fundamental security, and when you have available to the farmers some of the innovations, the technologies, really basic things like the ability to pump water through very basic pumps to get to their crops. And things like being able to do a dry season crop. So some of it is kind of fundamental, but when given those opportunities, we saw a green wall emerge in the Sahel because of the efforts of local farmers, many of whom are women. And so I think, there's one thing if you want to go to big commercial scale, but the ability to catalyze and continue to support that kind of local level farming is enormous, and we see it happen. Conflict undermines it.
So I want to ask all 3 of you one last question to close it out. All 4 of us live at least in the Washington, D.C. area. We admit that. At least I'll admit that. And it's just boiling over in tribalism and partisanship. But here's one issue that you bring us together where everybody agrees. People invest. Just 2 weeks ago, there was this bipartisan bill called Global Food Security Act that was signed into law. Bipartisan in Congress. Yay, we can applaud to that, Catherine. It was great, signed into law by President Trump. And there's a reason for that. So I want you to each tell one really quick story to give us hope, the peace part of it, that gives you hope, that says, I saw something that makes me know that hunger and conflict is not going to be the world in which our children live, that it is going to be the peace moment. And it's because people in Congress and policymakers do get that this is important. Michael, one quick story in your travels. So
let me just say, on the Congress part, Congress has a reputation for not having done too much on anything. But in this space, on global development humanitarian things, it's a well-kept secret about the enormous amount of legislation that Congress has passed over the last 5, 6, 7
Yep,
years.
yep.
And it's bipartisan, and it really is pointing the U.S. direction in a very positive direction. It's under this administration, as you say, the Global Food Security Act. There's the foreign assistance accountability, transparency and accountability. There's a lot of really good stuff that Congress steps up. Why is that? Because when I'm traveling and I'm seeing kids on the ground and we're seeing the kind of David Nabarro helps get this Sun movement up and running. It's really powerful. People are invested in improving the education of the nutrition of their children. The U.S. is a partner in that, and it's making a difference. You know, stunting is being reduced in some places. The conflict places are a challenge, but in a lot of other places we've seen positive progress. So you bring results back to the Congress. It's the right thing to do. It's a smart thing to do, and frankly, it works. So it's a good thing to invest in, and I think that makes a good case when I'm talking to members of Congress.
Fabulous. General Ward?
I'll be quick. This is the heartland of America. It's the heart of the human being. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are. It reminds me of World War II stories when you hear of American soldiers going in the streets of Europe and handing a piece of chocolate candy to a small kid who had known nothing about that. Your servicemen and women globally have that heart. We as a human race have that heart. There are one or two out there that probably you would doubt it from time to time. But we have that. And so it's that spirit of treating someone as you would want to be treated. And it's as simple as that. If we practice that, we would go beyond where we are today if we practice that en masse. That's happening amongst your armed forces members as they work with their partners in the developmental community and the diplomatic community to cause their fellow human being to be a bit better off where they are than they might otherwise be.
Nancy, you've been in some tough places in the world. What gives you hope?
Well, I am leaving on Saturday to accompany 30 youth leaders from some of the toughest conflict-affected countries on the planet to a 2-day dialogue with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. Each of these youth leaders have experienced terrible tragedy in their life. They've been pulled from a bus by Boko Haram, bombed in a stadium in Uganda by al-Shabaab, on their way to university in Aleppo when suddenly they had to go across the border into Lebanon and become a refugee. I mean, they've each had these terrible moments of tragedy that have changed their lives forever, and each of them has decided not to choose bitterness and anger and a sense of victimhood, but instead to become leaders in their own communities and to build peace in whatever way they can. The young man headed to Aleppo started a school for Syrian children in Lebanon so that they wouldn't miss out on their early education. There are unbelievable stories of hope and resilience, and you know, that's what we need to invest in. You're looking at a world that is very young. Most conflict countries have the majority of their population under the age of 15, hugely expanding. They need to be the leaders for peace, and that's who we need to partner with going forward. I will say on this hopefulness and congressional action, it is because of people like everyone here. I mean, your action, your caring does get heard and communicated. I can't tell you how many times I hear from members of Congress that, oh yeah, we got phone calls on that. Don't think your voice doesn't matter. It does matter. We know that from public opinion polls that Americans have a deep reservoir of support for these issues. But we don't always vote on that. So this is where your voice can make a difference.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ambassador Michael Klosson, Nancy Lindborg, and General Kip Ward.